Hey guys, today's story is about a question most of us never really stop to ask. Where did poor peasants sleep on the road? Long before the age of hotels, Airbnbs, or even basic motels. And before we dive in, tell me, from where and which time are you watching this? Maybe you're tucked in your bed in the city, or perhaps listening from some small village in the quiet countryside. Imagine for a moment, centuries ago, someone like you, tired from the day, asking themselves the same question but with no soft mattress, no pillow and no roof. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often imagine peasants tied to the land, spending their lives near their villages, bound to their fields. But not every peasant stayed home all the time. Many had to travel to markets, to fairs, to deliver grain, to seek new work, or sometimes simply to escape hunger and war. And the moment they stepped outside their village boundary, the question of where they might sleep became very real. Now picture this: a dusty road stretching out in front of you, rutted with the marks of carts. No streetlights, only the dimming sun sinking beyond the horizon. If you're a poor traveler, maybe a peasant with little more than a sack slung over your shoulder, night is coming fast. You know you cannot afford an inn. Inns, where they existed, were expensive and often reserved for merchants, clergy, or travelers with coin. So what do? You look around, scanning the land, searching for even the smallest patch where you might rest. The truth is, poor peasants often slept wherever they could, and that could mean almost anywhere: under hedges, beneath bridges, in barns if they were lucky, sometimes pressed against the walls of a church, or even directly on the open road itself. There was no one universal solution. Survival on the road meant improvisation, and each night could bring a different kind of resting place. Imagine first the hedgerow. In medieval Europe, hedges were everywhere, planted to mark the borders of fields, to keep animals from straying, and to divide one strip of land from another. Thick, thorny, and alive with birds, hedges were not exactly comfortable, but they offered a sort of cover. A weary traveler could crouch down beneath the branches, hidden from the wind, perhaps hidden also from watchful eyes, because privacy mattered. Being seen sleeping by the roadside wasn't only embarrassing, it could also be dangerous. Bandits, patrols, or simply suspicious villagers might not take kindly to a stranger dozing near their land. But hedges had their own problems. Insects crawled everywhere, dew soaked into clothes, and the thorns themselves could tear at skin. Still, it was better than lying openly on the road, and so many peasants learned to curl up like animals, folding themselves into whatever little hollow they could find, praying for rest before morning came. Sometimes, though, a hedge wasn't enough. Maybe the night was stormy, with rain lashing down, or the cold was too sharp. Then the traveler looked for barns. Barns, after all, were warm places, filled with hay or straw. And if you were very fortunate, the animals themselves, cows, horses, goats, would share their body heat. But barns belonged to someone, and trespassing wasn't exactly welcome. Peasants often had to sneak inside under the cover of darkness, slipping past farm dogs and hoping not to wake a farmer. The smell of animals, the scratch of straw, and the fear of being caught meant sleep was shallow, but at least it was sleep. And barns weren't always locked. Sometimes charitable farmers allowed strangers to shelter, especially if they claimed to be pilgrims. Pilgrimage was one of the few accepted reasons for a poor man or woman to travel, and saying you were on the road for God could soften hearts that might otherwise turn you away. So many peasants learned to wear the mask of a pilgrim, even if they were simply wandering laborers. A cross scratched on a cloak, a few words of piety, and suddenly a barn might be open to you. Now, if barns were unavailable, another option was churches. Churches dotted the landscape of medieval Europe, standing as some of the only stone structures in many villages. Their porches, often roofed but open, became a kind of shelter for travel. Sleeping inside the church itself wasn't always possible, but the porch, or sometimes even the cemetery grounds, offered a space that felt safer than the open road. There was something about the presence of a holy place, even if it didn't truly protect you from the cold. Many accounts from the Middle Ages describe travelers huddled against church walls, their breath steaming in the night, as the bells above marked the passing hours. And then there were bridges. Many bridges had small alcoves, or sheltered corners where a person could curl up. In towns, bridges were often built with houses or chapels along them, and beneath these, the weary could sometimes find cover. Of course, rivers brought their own chill, the damp air clinging to the skin, but if it was a choice between rain-soaked fields and the shadow of a bridge, the bridge. Still, for many peasants, the most common solution was simply the ground itself. They laid out their cloaks, or sometimes just curled up with no covering at all, directly beside the road they walked during the day. The soil beneath them was hard, the sky above vast and indifferent. Sometimes stars twinkled, sometimes clouds gathered, and sometimes wolves howled in the distance. Sleep was not deep, it was more of a half-rest, interrupted by fear of footsteps, fear of animals, or fear of thieves. But poor peasants had little choice. And here is where imagination matters. Imagine yourself, lying on your side, on the bare earth of a medieval path. You hear the faint crack of twigs nearby. Is it another traveler? Is it a robber? Or is it nothing but the night wind moving through the branch? You try to steady your breathing, forcing your body into rest, even though your mind is awake with unease. The human body adapts though, and many poor travelers simply learn to live with that unease. But let's pause here and think, why did so many peasants need to sleep on the road at all? Travel wasn't something peasants did for pleasure. They weren't tourists. They moved because they had to. Maybe their lord sent them on an errand. Maybe famine forced them to wander in search of food. Maybe a war had destroyed their home. Or maybe, just maybe, they hoped for better work in another town. Whatever the reason, they had to walk, sometimes for days, and that meant finding places to sleep became part of life. The medieval world did have inns and taverns, of course, but these were not for the poor. A bed at an inn could cost more than a peasant might earn in a week. Even sleeping in the common room, on the floor among strangers, required coin, and peasants often had no coin at all, so the road itself became their resting place. Sometimes they shared that road with other. Bands of travelers often formed, strangers walking together for safety. At night they would huddle in groups, sleeping in circles, much like soldiers on campaign. A fire, if they could risk it, gave warmth, but fire was dangerous. It drew attention, and attention wasn't always good. Many peasants chose darkness instead, wrapping their cloaks tight and letting the cold seep in rather than risk being found. And yet, despite the discomfort, there was something strangely human about it. To sleep on the road was to join a long tradition of wanderers, pilgrims, and poor souls who had no fixed home. Each night was different. Each night a gamble. Some nights you found straw, some nights you found stone, and some nights you found nothing but earth. By now you can see the pattern. Poor peasants had to make do with what they could find. Hedges, barns, churches, bridges, the road itself, all became beds, depending on luck and circumstance. There was no single answer to the question, where did they sleep? Because the answer was always changing. Each night was its own story, and each story tells us something about the fragile, precarious life of the medieval poor.
The road stretched on, dusty and uneven, bordered by hedges that whispered softly when the evening wind passed through them. A weary peasant, carrying little more than a bundle of bread crusts, wrapped in cloth, trudged slowly along it. His feet were blistered, hardened by days of walking, and the thought of where he would rest that night pressed heavily on his mind. In a time when inns were scarce and far too costly for someone of his standing, the road itself became not just a place of travel, but also a place of uneasy rest. Peasants who traveled, whether for work, pilgrimage, or because they had no home at all, often found themselves forced to use the landscape as their bed. The roadside ditch, though damp and sometimes foul with runoff, offered the thin comfort of concealment. By lying low, half hidden in the earth's shallow curve, a traveler might feel less exposed to thieves or patrols. The ground, uneven and prickly with weeds, would press against their bones, but fatigue softened all discomfort. Some clutched their bundles to their chests, not for warmth, but to ensure no passing hand could snatch the only possessions they had. The danger was not only from humans. Wild dogs, wolves in certain regions, and even rats prowled the dark edges of villages and roads, drawn by the scent of food. A peasant asleep in the open might wake to the sound of scavenging claws, scratching at their meager belongings. Some travelers carried sticks, not just to aid their walk, but to swing at intruders of the night,
Yet more often than not, exhaustion dulled vigil. A man or woman might drift into slumber on hard earth, only half aware of the rustling in the bushes. When luck favored them, peasants could find shelter beneath a hedgerow thick enough to shield from the wind. There the ground was a little softer, scattered with leaves, and the thorns above offered a kind of crooked roof. In autumn, fallen foliage formed a rough blanket, though dampness soon crept into skin and bone. Some travelers gathered straw from fields where harvest had been reaped, not daring to steal but collecting what the reapers left behind. A bundle of straw beneath one's body was the closest thing to a mattress that most peasants could hope for on the road. The road itself told many silent stories of such sleepers. Flattened patches in the grass near crossroads, scorched marks where small fires had been lit, and the occasional broken wooden cup abandoned in haste, all testified to the countless weary souls who had paused their journey at those very spots. The peasant road sleeper was not rare, it was almost expected, for in a world where most people never left their village, those who did were often driven by desperation, pilgrimage, or punishment, and the road was both their passage and their bed. Some nights travelers huddled together for safety. A group of peasants bound for seasonal harvest might form a little camp beside the road, arranging themselves in a circle. The strongest kept watch for a while, eyes heavy, until sleep overcame them too. They would share whatever scraps of food they had, chew on dry bread, and sometimes whisper prayers before closing their eyes under the indifferent stars. For those without fire, the cold cut deep. For those daring enough to strike flint and kindle a flame, there was the risk of attracting attention, sometimes helpful, like a passing fellow traveler, but sometimes dangerous, like a patrol demanding coin, or a band of thieves who robbed without mercy. Religious houses, monasteries, and small chapels occasionally offered mercy. Some poor peasants found refuge by lying near the walls of such holy places, believing no one would dare disturb them under God's shadow. Monks sometimes gave bread, or allowed the weary to sleep in barns. Yet even here, safety was uncertain. Rules varied, and suspicion of vagabonds was widespread. The line between traveler and beggar was thin, and the punishment for the latter could be severe. Many peasants preferred the open ditch to the risk of being beaten, or driven off by guards. As the moon climbed high, pale and cold, the road took on a silence broken only by distant owls, or the clatter of a wagon wheel far away. For a lone peasant, lying on his side with his arm for a pillow, the world seemed endless. Sleep was shallow, broken by the bite of insects, the ache of muscles, and the occasional jolt of fear that someone was approaching. He might dream of home, a straw bed in a hut, a warm fire, his children's faces, or of food more filling than the crust tucked in his bundle. But dawn always came, pale and slow, and with it the necessity of rising, brushing off the dirt, and moving forward. There were seasons when sleeping by the road was easier. In summer the air was warm, and the long twilight gave a sense of lingering safety. In winter, however, the road was merciless. Snow gathered in drifts, winds cut to the marrow, and peasants wrapped their thin cloaks tighter, knowing full well that sleep could slip into death if they were not careful. It was not unheard of for travelers to be found frozen stiff by the roadside, their bundles untouched, their faces blank with the peace of a final sleep. Children, too, sometimes walked these roads with their parents, small bodies curled against their mothers, covered with whatever cloth was available, while fathers tried to keep the fire alive. It was a brutal education for the young to learn that the world's floor was cold and unyielding. Yet survival taught them early. Never waste food, never trust strangers too quickly, and always keep walking when you can. Even the animals of peasants, the occasional goat or chicken carried along, shared in these harsh nights. A goat, tethered by the roadside, might bleat in protest until exhaustion stilled it. Chickens tucked into baskets were quiet, heads buried under wings. They too endured the road as their masters did, with no promise of comfort. Not all road sleeping was desperate. Sometimes during festivals or market days, peasants who traveled too far to return home in one day would choose to lie down on the outskirts of a town, their bellies full of ale and their purses a little heavier from trade. These nights had laughter, songs, and the chatter of voices drifting into the dark before sleep claimed them. The ground was just as hard, the air just as cold,
but the spirit was lighter. Still, whether by choice or by necessity, the peasant sleeper on the road lived a fragile existence. The earth beneath was never truly safe, never truly warm, and the morning always brought the same tired question: how much farther must I go, and will I survive the next night's rest?
The night deepened, and the damp air of the countryside clung to every surface. After the peasants had gathered some dry straw and settled along the edge of the road, their world shrank into little more than the patch of earth beneath them and the soundscape surrounding them. Yet, that patch of earth was not a comfortable one. The ground was never smooth. Sometimes it was rutted from cartwheels, hardened like stone by countless footsteps. Sometimes, after a recent rain, it turned to sticky mud that clung to their clothing, and sometimes it was simply scattered with pebbles and weeds, neither soft nor kind to a body aching from labor. But this, more often than not, was where peasants closed their eyes. There was no concept of pillows or cushions for such travelers. A bundle of rags, a folded cloak if one owned such a luxury, or merely the crook of their own arm beneath their head. That was all they had. To lie on the road meant choosing between exhaustion and discomfort. The bones pressed against the hard ground. The chill crept up through the soil, and insects skittered across their skin. Yet exhaustion was a powerful master, and eventually the body surrendered to sleep, no matter how rough the bedding. Sometimes a fallen tree or a roadside ditch offered more shelter. A ditch was not clean. It could be damp. It could be crawling with bugs. But at least it hid a sleeper from the eyes of passing riders or guards who might accuse them of loitering or vagrancy. And in times when suspicion ran high, peasants preferred invisibility to comfort. Sleep became something stolen, half-kept, never fully embraced. In some regions, travelers would search for the shelter of a hedge. Hedges grew thick and wide at the edges of farmland. Crawling beneath them, peasants could tuck themselves into a hollow, hidden from the wind. The branches scratched and snagged, but the cover they provided from the elements was precious. There was a strange comfort in sleeping pressed into the earth, hidden under leaves, hearing the scurrying of small animals and the rustle of branches overhead. It was not safety, but it was something like privacy. And when the road stretched across open fields with no trees, no ditches, no hedges, sleep became an act of bravery. Imagine lying in the middle of an open plain, with nothing between you and the stars but your ragged cloak. The wind whistled freely, chilling the bone. Every sound, an owl calling, a fox's step in the grass, the distant bark of a dog seemed sharper. Every movement in the shadows felt like a threat. And still peasants lay down and closed their eyes because there was nowhere else to go. But not all nights on the road were spent entirely beneath the open sky. Sometimes, when luck favored them, a peasant might stumble upon a roadside shrine. These shrines dotted the medieval landscape, little structures of stone or wood, dedicated to saints or holy figures. They were not built for sleeping, yet their overhanging roofs, their sheltered alcoves, and their steps offered some reprieve. To rest against the cold wall of a shrine, under the gaze of a carved saint, gave not only physical shelter but a sense of spiritual protection. A tired traveler might whisper a prayer before curling up at its base, hoping that divine mercy would extend to keeping them safe through the night. And there were barns, though these were not always accessible. A peasant traveling through unfamiliar lands might plead with a farmer for permission to sleep in a barn, among the hay. Sometimes, if the farmer's heart was kind, permission was granted. The hay was softer than the hard earth of the road, and the smell of animals, though pungent, was familiar and comforting. But other times, farmers turned strangers away, fearing theft, fearing disease, or simply unwilling to share what little they had. When turned away, the peasants had no choice but to return to the road, where stone and mud awaited them. In colder months, sleep became even more fragile. Without fire, without blankets, many peasants relied on the oldest method of survival, huddling together. Families pressed close, sharing what little warmth their bodies produced. The young curled against the old, and sometimes travelers who were strangers by day became reluctant companions by night, lying side by side out of necessity rather than the risk of theft lingered. Someone might awaken to find a small bundle gone, but freezing was a greater danger.
To survive the cold, peasants surrendered to the uncomfortable closeness of others, breathing in the scent of unwashed bodies and worn wool, clinging to life through shared warmth. And there were nights when peasants simply did not sleep. Fatigue weighed on them, but danger outweighed exhaustion. If the road was too crowded with thieves, if rumors of patrols spread, if the land was too wild, they stayed away. They sat with backs against trees, keeping watch through the dark hours. One slept lightly while another kept their eyes open, trading moments of rest. Sleep in such times was not a gift freely given. It was rationed in fragments, stolen in minutes, never in hours. When dawn finally broke, it was not refreshing. The body rose stiff and aching. Mud clung to their clothes, straw stuck to their hair, and their limbs carried the memory of every stone pressed into them during the night. And yet they stood, they shook themselves free, and they began again, because peasants had no choice. The road did not allow for comfort. The road allowed only for endurance. But within this harshness, there were also quiet moments of beauty. To wake on the road was to wake beneath the wide sky, to see the first light spill across fields, to hear the birds begin their song. For a brief moment before hunger and labor claimed them again, peasants could lift their eyes and witness a world unbroken by walls or roofs. The world was raw, it was unforgiving, but it was vast. And perhaps in those first moments of dawn, some peasants felt a fleeting kind of peace. Still, that peace never lasted. The road remained the road. It was not a bed, nor a shelter, nor a home. It was only a strip of earth indifferent to those who lay upon it. And yet, generation after generation, poor travelers returned to it, night after night, closing their eyes against its hardness, finding rest where there should have been none, because in truth there was no other place to go. And as the centuries passed, the memory of these sleepless nights on roadsides faded into history. Yet, if you walk the old paths, if you stand at the edge of a field or beneath a hedge, you can almost imagine the shapes of those long-ago travelers, curled upon the earth, waiting for sleep that never fully came.
And so the road stretches onward, winding across low hills and into valleys, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of damp soil and crushed leaves. The peasants, weary from their day's trudging, find themselves faced with the question once again: where shall they rest tonight? They have no coins to pay for the comfort of an inn, no patron to offer them shelter, and no warm cottage awaiting their arrival. Their bed must be the road itself, or whatever small kindness the road happens to offer. The peasants move as shadows in the dimming light. Some carry bundles tied to sticks, others hold nothing but their aching backs and calloused feet. The younger ones, those who still carry the strength of youth, look ahead at the dwindling daylight with worry, knowing that once night closes in, the choice is narrow. To sleep in darkness is not just to risk the chill, but also to risk the company of strangers. Some desperate like themselves, others perhaps dangerous. By now they know the signs to look for. A stand of tall trees near a brook, with roots raised just high enough to carve out a hollow space where a body can curl. A roadside chapel, its tiny porch roof jutting forward to keep at least part of the ground dry, though the priest may frown upon strangers lingering too close. Sometimes even the ruins of old buildings, stone walls long forgotten by their lords, serve as makeshift shelters, giving protection from wind if not from rain. The peasants rarely travel alone. They cling to one another in small groups, because to sleep as a single body on the road is to court misfortune. Wolves are less common than stories suggest, but men with hunger in their bellies or malice in their eyes, are dangers too real. Safety is found in numbers, in the steady rise and fall of familiar breaths, in the nearness of voices murmuring into the dark. Tonight they come across a haystack towering above the field like a small hill. Haystacks are both blessing and curse. To burrow into them is to find warmth, the sweet, dry smell of summer fields, and the softness of straw against weary bones. Yet farmers are watchful of their stacks, for hay is wealth, and a spark from a lantern, or the careless movement of a stranger, could set it ablaze. Still, the road does not offer luxuries. One by one, the peasants creep close, pulling bits of hay loose, shaping shallow hollows where they may curl unseen. The stack creaks with shifting weight, but it holds. Those too cautious for hay drift toward the edge of the road, where a small grove offers cover. They press themselves against the earth, laying down bundles of twigs or thin branches for bedding. The ground is cold, but it is theirs, and the earth does not demand a price for its use. They tuck their arms beneath their heads, some muttering prayers, others whispering fragments of old songs to lull themselves toward sleep. The sounds of the night begin to gather around them. Crickets chirp from unseen corners. An owl hoots, deep and hollow, echoing across the dark. The road itself seems to sigh beneath the shifting of air, as if it remembers every step that has pressed upon it through the centuries. In the distance, faint torches flicker, perhaps a manor's watchman, or perhaps another group of wanderers, setting up their own camp. For the peasants, it is best not to wander too closely. Not every night on the road is the same. Some nights the weather offers mercy, with clear skies and stars like pinpricks of silver light. Then the peasants lie on their backs and gaze upward, finding patterns in the heavens. A plough, a stag, a wheel of fire. The constellations are more than ornaments, they are guides, pointing north or south, east or west, reminding wanderers of their place in the vast world. On such nights, though the ground is hard, the sky feels wide enough to cradle their dreams. Other nights, storms descend, rain lashes at their faces, soaking their thin woolen garments until every thread clings heavy to their skin. In such times, sleep becomes impossible, and survival itself feels uncertain. They huddle together beneath trees, pressing their cloaks tight, praying for dawn. The poorest of them sometimes build small shelters of branches and mud, crude lean-tos angled against the wind, more symbolic than sturdy. In these shelters they wait, teeth chattering, as the storm drums its rhythm overhead. The road is indifferent to suffering. It does not pause to pity the weary traveler, nor does it rage against their presence. It simply lies there, carrying footsteps one after another, watching the endless procession of lives that pass across it. Some are merchants, heavy purses clinking. Some are knights, mounted on sleek horses, banners snapping proudly. But the peasants, barefoot, bone-tired and anonymous, are perhaps the road's most faithful companions. As dawn begins to creep once more across the sky, those who managed some rest rise slowly, stiff from the chill, their bodies bent like reeds under too much weight. They brush dirt from their garments, shake straw from their hair, and begin again. They leave no trace of their stay, no hearth-fire's ashes, no lasting mark of their presence. The road swallows their nights just as it carries their. Sometimes, when fortune smiles faintly, they encounter roadside crosses, wooden markers erected by travelers long past, meant as places of prayer and remembrance. Beneath these crosses, peasants often kneel before curling into sleep, trusting that the holy sign might shield them from harm. Superstition mixes with faith. The boundary between the two blurs in the quiet hours of night. A cross in the moonlight seems to hum with unseen power, and though it offers no roof, many find comfort in its shadow. Children, if they are part of the group, fare differently. Their small bodies tire quickly, and they often sleep wherever they collapse, on a parent's lap, against the trunk of a tree, on a bed of rags spread hastily across the dirt. Parents do what they can to shield them, wrapping them in cloaks, keeping watch through half the night, listening to each shallow breath. The road hardens children early, yet even on the bare earth, they dream sometimes of feasts they will never taste, sometimes of games they will never play, and sometimes simply of walking without end, as though the road itself has become their lullaby. The peasants speak little of comfort. For them, sleep is not a luxury, but a necessity, a moment when the body refuses to go farther. They do not ask for softness, for warmth, for shelter beyond what can be stolen from the land itself. A bed is not a piece of furniture. It is a patch of ground, a heap of straw, a corner where the wind does not bite too sharply. They sleep because they must, and because tomorrow the road will still demand their steps. Yet there is a strange poetry in their night. The way a group of weary souls curls together, breathing as one, their hearts beating like a single drum beneath the stars. The way silence falls heavy, yet never fully absolute, for the world itself whispers on, the rustle of leaves,
the murmur of a nearby stream, the occasional creak of a cartwheel in the distance. These are lullabies too, given freely to those who have nothing else. And so, part by part, night by night, the peasants teach us a truth that feels both humbling and eternal. A bed is not always a place of comfort, nor a symbol of wealth. It can be as simple as the earth beneath your back and the sky above your head. It can be a stolen hour of rest in a haystack, or a damp hollow in the roots of an oak. It can be nothing more than the strength to close your eyes despite hunger, fear, and weariness. The road is not cruel, but neither is it kind. It is simply there, endless and unfeeling, carrying those too poor to travel with ease, those for whom every step is a burden, and every night is a gamble between exhaustion and survival, and yet somehow they endure. They rise from their rough sleeping places each morning and continue, because there is always another mile, another village, another chance, however small, that tomorrow might be gentler than today.
So the road continued, stretching like a pale thread across the countryside, weaving between fields and patches of woodland, guiding weary feet ever onward. For the peasant who walked it, there was no luxury of choice, only the steady rhythm of trudging steps, the weight of a bundle over the shoulder, and the quiet pressing question of where, once again, to lay one's head when the sun dipped and the world turned cold. By now the pattern of sleep had become a matter of comfort, but of survival. A peasant did not expect a bed. A peasant did not even expect a roof. What he expected, instead, was to find some corner of earth that would not push him away. The road itself was dangerous at night. Bandits, wolves, and patrols made sleeping openly a risk. Yet, pressed by exhaustion, many did it anyway. They lay down against a milestone, curled into the ditch where weeds grew tall, or tucked themselves against the raised edges of a cart track. A blanket, if they had one, was spread beneath them to soften the ground, and their cloak or shawl pulled close to trap the faintest warmth. If they owned neither, then the hard soil and the sharp night air became their only companions. In some parts of the countryside, roadside chapels offered a sliver of mercy, built for travelers to pause and pray. These small stone structures sometimes had benches inside, or at least a sheltered alcove. If a peasant was lucky, he might slip into one unseen, crouching in the shadows until dawn. There was danger, too, in this choice, for such buildings were not meant to be slept in. A passing priest, or even another traveler, could drive them out with curses or blows. Still, the chapel walls broke the wind, and the carved saints gazed silently down, unmoving, as the weary bodies surrendered to rest. For some, that was enough. Others sought barns, though barns were not easily given. To enter one uninvited was theft in the eyes of the law, and peasants knew well the penalties that followed theft. Yet hunger and exhaustion do not always bend to law. Many a desperate soul crept quietly into a barn at night, burrowing into straw, careful not to wake the animals. The warmth of cattle or horses was a treasure beyond words. Their bodies gave off heat, and the straw muffled sound, making it easier to disappear into sleep. If discovered, the punishment could be harsh, a beating, a chase into the night, or worse. Yet for one night of warmth, many took the risk. By the roadside, there were also trees, hedgerows, and copses where a traveler could disappear from sight. To sleep beneath a tree was common enough that it hardly raised notice. Some peasants carried no more than a rough cloak or ragged mat, which they would spread upon roots or soil. In summer, this might be pleasant, with the air mild and the leaves whispering overhead. In winter, it could be deadly. A peasant who fell asleep too cold might not wake again. Still, when the body could walk no farther, there was little choice. The earth became the bed, and the sky the blanket. Travelers sometimes found company in one another. It was safer to sleep in groups, for wolves hesitated at numbers, and bandits preferred lone victims. So peasants huddled together on the edges of roads or in fields, sharing what warmth they had. They whispered stories to pass the time, or muttered prayers, or simply fell silent, each clinging to his own thoughts. Companionship did not soften the ground beneath them, but it steadied the heart. A man who slept beside another was less likely to wake with a knife at his throat. In this way, sleep was not merely about rest, but about trust, however fragile. There were, of course, bridges. The undersides of bridges, where stone arches met earth, created hollows that shielded the wind. Peasants crawled beneath them, out of sight, where the noise of water muffled the world above. To sleep beside a river carried its own risks: flood, dampness, insects. But the cover was worth it. Bridges were liminal places, where travelers crossed from one world into another, and those who slept beneath them were half forgotten, caught in the cracks of society. Yet many peasants left their weariness there, hidden between stone and straw. Another place, though seldom spoken of, was the churchyard. The dead did not complain if the living lay beside them, and the stone walls often encircled the yard, offering some protection. To curl against a tomb, or even stretch out upon the grass between graves, was grim comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Fear of spirits kept some away, but others, too weary to care, accepted the silent company of the departed. A graveyard bed was soft compared to stone roads, and the stillness of the place, broken only by owls or night winds, could soothe even a restless heart. If caught, however, the shame was heavy. Sleeping in sacred ground was frowned upon, and peasants risked being driven out by the living, even as they sought shelter among the dead. Not every night was spent in open places. Sometimes a sympathetic villager offered a corner of a floor, or space near a hut. Hospitality varied from region to region, from family to family. Some gave freely, remembering that all were children of God. Others demanded coin, bread, or labor in exchange. A peasant might chop wood, fetch water, or mend something small in return for a night's rest indoors. In such cases, the peasant learned to be grateful for even a plank floor, for it meant warmth and safety. But those nights were rare, and most slept outside, between earth and sky, as if the world itself were both cradle and coffin. The habits of roadside sleep etched themselves into the body. The back grew used to hard ground, the ears to rustling grass and distant hooves, the eyes to the briefest flicker of rest before dawn stirred again. It was not restful sleep, it was survival sleep, broken, shallow, uneasy. A peasant awoke stiff, hungry, sometimes soaked with dew, and yet rose again to walk, because walking was the only way forward. Day after day, road after road, sleep became not a refuge but another burden carried. As centuries passed, the rhythms shifted but never truly changed. Even in later ages, when inns became more common, they were not places for peasants. Inns demanded coin, and peasants had little coin to give. The road remained their bed, the hedgerow their pillow, the ditch their blanket. The poorest wandered, slept, and woke again, repeating the cycle that history rarely bothers to record. For who would write of a man asleep in a ditch, or a woman curled against a wall? Their lives were quiet, their beds invisible, their history almost forgotten. And yet if one were to travel those same roads today, one might still see shadows of the past. The old chapels stand, their alcoves empty but waiting. The barns remain, with straw piled high. The trees whisper as they always have, and the bridges still shelter the space beneath. In every hollow, in every darkened corner, there lingers the memory of those countless peasants who once lay there, gathering what little strength they could before another day of walking began.
The road never truly ended for the poor peasant. What had begun as a day's walk often stretched into weeks, a pilgrimage, a trade errand, a search for harvest work, or simply the restless drifting that poverty encouraged. Whatever the reason, peasants found themselves bound to pathways that cut through fields, forests, and forgotten stretches of land. With no coin to spare, no inn willing to welcome them without payment, the question repeated each evening, "Where shall I rest tonight?" The answers were rarely glamorous and even less comfortable. By the time twilight deepened into night, the poor peasant had surveyed hedgerows, tree roots, bridges and barns, not in search of beauty but survival. And as the candlelight of villages dwindled into darkness, the land revealed its quiet resting places for the weary. If one could follow such a traveler for a single journey, part of the mystery would be solved. The sixth evening of his travel, for instance,
shows the habits that centuries of peasants relied upon. When the sun dipped low, fields turned golden, and shadows grew longer, the peasant began his usual ritual. His eyes scanned the roadside for anything resembling shelter. Not shelter in the noble sense, no roofs, no doors, but the smallest break in the wind, the faintest promise of dryness, or a patch of ground less stony than the last. Bridges offered the first refuge. Stone bridges, byways crossing streams, and wooden spans alike, all of them created shadows beneath their arches. Beneath a medieval bridge, the peasant might find soil hardened from lack of rain, or straw blown in by the wind. Of course, the smell of water lingered, and rats frequented the same space. But the arch blocked the wind, and the flow of the stream masked distant noises, lulling one into uneasy slumber. If no bridge was near, hedgerows became the next choice. Thick hedges, often planted to divide farmland, created pockets of concealment. A peasant slipping into these hedges would crouch, then curl tightly upon the earth. Here he risked thorns, nettles, and the sharp bite of insects. Yet the hedge provided invisibility, a barrier between him and prying eyes. The importance of invisibility cannot be overstated. To sleep openly on the road was to invite danger, thieves, patrols, or simply suspicious villagers. A hedge, uncomfortable as it was, meant a measure of safety. Sometimes, if fortune tilted in his favor, a haystack stood within reach. Farmers piled hay high after the harvest, binding it with rope or stacking it against barns. A peasant could burrow into such hay, its dry warmth insulating him through the night. But here lay another risk: discovery. Farmers often punished intruders harshly, seeing such rest as theft of their labor. Yet desperation made the haystack alluring. The scratch of straw against the skin was tolerable when compared to the bite of frost. Church porches became another common refuge. Nearly every village, however poor, had a small church, and these structures usually included a covered entryway. The porch offered a roof overhead, protection from rain, and often a stone bench along the wall. The parish priest might frown upon it, but many turned a blind eye after all. The scriptures themselves spoke of offering mercy to the weary traveler. So peasants huddled against the stone, wrapped in their threadbare cloaks, drifted to uneasy sleep within the sanctity of the church walls. There were, of course, less conventional places: barns if the doors were left ajar, mills if one dared risk the noise of turning wheels, abandoned cottages, half-ruined and roofless, even ditches, when no better option presented itself. The ditch, though, was dangerous. Rainwater collected there, and a sleeping body could wake drenched, shivering, and ill. Yet the ditch hid one from the road, an invisibility more valuable than comfort. And in forests, hollow trees provided crude beds. The base of an oak, split with age, could fit a curled body within. Forest travel was already risky. Bandits, wolves, and superstition alike haunted those places, but if the road forced a peasant into woodland, a hollow tree might save his life. It is worth imagining the sensations of such nights: a body exhausted from walking all day, feet blistered, shoulders aching beneath the weight of a sack, darkness descending, cool air replacing the warmth of the sun, hunger pressing in, since meals were meager. The peasant lies down, not in comfort but collapse. A thin cloak is spread, sometimes nothing at all, and the body curls upon the ground. The earth is lumpy, cold, alive with beetles. Sleep comes not as rest, but as surrender. And throughout the night, waking moments remind him of where he lies: the rustle of leaves, the drip of water, the shuffle of some unseen animal. Yet paradoxically, these nights became routine. Peasants were used to the harshness. A nobleman would have found such sleep unbearable. A merchant would call it dangerous. But for the poor it was simply life. They grew accustomed to sleeping wherever the land allowed, their senses sharpened by habit, their bodies hardened by necessity. Travelers' tales from medieval records occasionally describe peasants glimpsed at dawn, rising stiffly from beneath hedges, shaking dew from their cloaks, or creeping away from the church porch before the bell rang for morning prayer. These figures were as much part of the landscape as the road itself, moving, sleeping, and vanishing into the rhythm of survival. When winter came, the problem grew dire. A summer night could be survived with little more than fatigue. But in December, frost bit into the very marrow. Fires were forbidden in the open fields, for smoke revealed one's presence, and dry wood was scarce, so peasants huddled together when possible, sharing body warmth beneath cloaks. Families traveling together curled into groups. Alone, a peasant relied on hay, churches, or even the mercy of strangers. Some nights he simply walked until dawn, knowing that to stop meant freezing. One may ask, did peasants ever dream in such conditions? The answer is uncertain, but it is easy to imagine that they did. Worn down by exhaustion, sleep came deep and sudden. Dreams of food, of warm hearth, of beds with blankets, must have filled their nights. Perhaps they dreamed of things they never had, or perhaps of simple survival, waking not hungry, not cold, not afraid. This endless cycle of searching for rest became part of the peasants' existence. The road dictated where they slept, and necessity taught them to adapt. Some nights were cruel, with rain and hunger pressing in. Others were merciful, with hay or stone porches offering reprieve. But every night carried the same truth. The poor peasant, though without coin, would find a place to lie down, however humble, however hidden. And as dawn rose once again, lighting the road in pale gold, the peasant stood, brushed dust from his clothes, and resumed walking. Behind him lay the memory of another night endured. Ahead of him, the promise or the threat of another evening's search.
The night deepened slowly, as if reluctant to give itself fully to darkness. A pale moon floated above the landscape, occasionally disappearing behind clouds that dragged lazily across the sky. The peasants, who had finally stopped their walking for the day, shifted restlessly on the ground. Some had found softer patches of grass, others had settled near roots of old trees, while a few simply curled up by the roadside itself, too exhausted to care about the hardness beneath their bones. It was never entirely safe to sleep on the road, but they had little choice. They were not lords with tents or merchants with wagons. They were only travelers caught between villages, wandering in search of work, carrying the small burdens of their lives. At night, the road became something different from the dusty path it was in daylight. In the darkness, it was both a lifeline and a danger, a strip of openness where strangers might appear without warning. Even in sleep, most of them did not rest fully. They dozed lightly, with one ear always alert for the sound of hooves or footsteps. Some wrapped themselves in rough woolen cloaks that smelled of sweat and smoke. Others had nothing but their thin shirts, and they huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat like animals in a pen. When the wind grew colder, mothers pulled their children closer, whispering soft words meant to comfort, but which soon trailed into silence as drowsiness overtook them. The children, less burdened by worry, surrendered more quickly to sleep, their breathing steady while their parents kept their eyes half open, staring at shadows that moved too easily in the flicker of moonlight. The smell of the road was always present. Dust clung to their clothes, mingling with the odor of sweat. From the fields nearby, a damp, earthy scent drifted in, reminding them of the soil they had left behind, the soil they once tilled but which never belonged to them. At times, a whiff of smoke from a faraway hearth reached them, sharp and cruel in its reminder that some people were inside, by a fire on straw beds, while they were outside on bare ground waiting for dawn. Those who were too restless to sleep kept their minds busy by watching the sky. The stars offered a strange sort of company. They were always there whether the peasants were home or wandering, silent witnesses to human struggle. Some peasants believed the stars told stories of saints or long-dead kings, their shapes forming lessons for those willing to see. Others did not bother with such thoughts. To them, stars were simply distant lights that made the night less frightening. Whatever their meaning, the stars gave the poor something the earth rarely did: constance. Occasionally a sound would stir the camp, the crack of a twig, the cry of a fox, the howl of a wolf farther away. Each noise made them shift, clutch their bundles, hold their breath for a moment. When nothing followed, they exhaled and settled again. The bravest among them sometimes rose to toss a stone in the direction of the sound, as if to remind the darkness that they too had the right to exist in it. But once quiet returned, they lay back down, shivering, and let their thoughts drift again. Sleep was not the same for everyone. The youngest sank quickly into dreams, soft and uncomplicated. The older ones dreamed more heavily, burdened with fragments of memory, harvests gone wrong, debts unpaid,
the sound of their landlord's voice demanding more grain than they. Some woke from these dreams with a sharp breath, confused for a moment about whether they were still in their homes or already on the road. Then they felt the hard ground beneath them, the cold against their skin, and they knew the road had taken them in, and it would hold them until morning. A few of the men took turns keeping watch, though not formally, not as soldiers do. It was more habit than system. If one man woke to relieve himself or stir the fire of twigs they had gathered, he stayed awake for a while, scanning the road, listening for travelers who might bring harm. When his eyelids grew heavy again, he lay down, trusting that someone else would wake in his place. They had no weapons beyond sticks and small knives used for bread, but sometimes the simple act of being alert was enough. Bandits preyed on the weak, and though peasants were always weak, the appearance of awareness could keep danger away. Hunger also crept into their rest. Many had not eaten since midday, and the memory of food, a crust of bread, a ladle of porridge, a wedge of cheese shared too thinly, haunted their stomachs. Hunger kept them half awake, their bodies reminding them that dawn would not bring feasts, but only another day of walking, searching, waiting. For peasants, food was not guaranteed. The thought of tomorrow's meal or lack of it often weighed heavier than the blanket of night. Despite all this, the road had its own rhythm that lulled them eventually. The silence between animal cries grew longer. The wind settled. Even the smallest children, restless at first, softened into steady breathing. One by one the peasants yielded to fatigue, until the group lay like scattered stones beside the road, unmoving, caught in that strange peace, which comes not from comfort but from sheer exhaustion. Morning always arrived slowly. It did not burst upon them. It crept with the faintest pale light spreading across the horizon, washing away the deep black of night. Birds were the first to notice it, their calls breaking the silence. Roosters from distant cottages added their voices, reminding the peasants that others were already awake, tending to lives more settled than theirs. The sleepers stirred reluctantly, blinking against the light. Some stretched, their joints stiff from the ground. Others rubbed their arms, shaking off the cold that had wrapped around them during the night. There was no real breakfast waiting. If someone had saved a piece of bread from yesterday, it was passed around, broken into pieces too small to satisfy anyone, yet enough to remind them of sharing. Water was sipped sparingly from a leather flask, each person taking just enough to wet their mouth. The taste of dryness lingered, but it was better than nothing. Children sometimes asked for more, and parents hushed them gently, promising they would find a stream later, though they knew streams were not always where one hoped. Once awake they gathered their belongings, which was to say, the little they had. A blanket rolled tightly, a sack with a shirt or two, maybe a small wooden spoon or a crude cup. These were their treasures, not because they were valuable, but because they were all that was left. Each item was checked, tied to a belt or slung over a shoulder, and then the peasants began again what they did every day. They walked. The road stretched endlessly, yet they followed it because it was their only guide. It wound through fields where dew glistened on grass, past small shrines where a carved figure of a saint watched over the crossroads. Some paused to cross themselves, murmuring quick prayers for safety, while others simply walked by, too weary to hope, but unwilling to offend. The shrines, the milestones, the trees bent by years of wind. These were the landmarks that told them they were still on a path, not lost in the world. Walking was as much a part of their lives as breathing. They did not speak much while doing it. Their footsteps became a rhythm, steady, dragging, sometimes broken when a child stumbled, or when someone paused to shift the weight of a sack. Conversations were brief, murmured about weather, about rumors of work in the next town, about whether the lord of a certain manor was known to be kinder than most. Then silence returned, broken only by the sound of shoes against dirt and the faint hum of the wind. The day would be long. The road was both friend and enemy. It carried them forward, but it also reminded them of how far they still had to go. Every village they passed became a question. Would they be allowed to sleep near its edge? Would they be chased away for fear of thievery? Would they find kindness, or would suspicion drive them back to the road again? As the sun rose higher, their thoughts of the night faded, replaced by the slow certainty of another day spent under the open sky.
And yet when evening came again, they knew the same ritual would return. The search for a spot to rest, the gathering of twigs for a weak fire, the slow surrender to fatigue despite the hunger, despite the fear, despite the ground that gave no comfort. And so it went, night after night. The road was their bed, the sky their blanket, and exhaustion their only promise of sleep.
And so the road stretched onward, winding like a faded ribbon through the countryside, each mile offering the peasants another uncertain choice: to keep walking into the darkness, or to stop and find whatever corner of safety the night would grant them. For a poor traveler, every step was measured not by distance, but by the slow pull of exhaustion in the body and the heavy weight of hunger. It was not simply a matter of where to go, but where the legs would finally refuse to carry them. Sleep, in such moments, was less of a choice and more of a surrender. If a peasant found himself in a stretch of open road with no village in sight, the simplest solution was often the most uncomfortable: the bare ground itself. The soil of the roadside became the mattress, uneven and hard, sometimes scattered with stones or clumps of grass. They would lower themselves down carefully, pulling their cloak tighter if they had one, and let the chill of the earth seep into their bones. A ditch, dug by rain or by passing carts, sometimes offered a bit of shelter from the wind, though it also brought dampness and the smell of mud. Yet for the exhausted, even this small hollow could feel like a bed. The road itself was never truly silent. Even after dark, the creak of cartwheels might echo faintly in the distance, or the hooves of a horse would strike against the packed dirt as a late traveler pressed on. Sometimes a group of merchants camped nearby, their fire crackling, voices low as they guarded their wares. For peasants with nothing but themselves, it was both comforting and intimidating to hear others so near. Comforting, because the sound of human voices kept away the loneliness of the night. Intimidating, because those voices could just as easily belong to thieves or guards who would not welcome strangers. Thus, most poor travelers would keep to the shadows, choosing quiet ditches, hedgerows, or the edges of fields rather than open spaces where they might be seen. The hedgerow, in particular, was a strange kind of shelter. Thick with thorns and tangled branches, it offered cover from the eyes of passers-by and broke some of the wind. Nestling against it meant risking scratches and insect bites, but it gave the illusion of walls in a world where walls were rare. A peasant might push into a gap between branches, lay down his bundle for a pillow, and rest in that narrow hollow. The smell of earth, leaves and dampness filled the air. In the stillness, the only company would be the rustling of small creatures, mice, beetles, sometimes a fox, slinking silently nearby. Sleep, under these conditions, was shallow and fragile, easily broken by the snap of a twig or the call of an owl. Fields, too, became common beds for those with nowhere else to go. By day they belonged to the landowner, carefully ploughed and seeded. By night, they belonged to anyone desperate enough to lie down in them. In summer, when the crops were tall, a peasant could hide in the rows of grain or barley, resting unseen beneath the stalks. The soft earth of the furrows, though uneven, was warmer than open ground. Yet this choice carried risk. Landowners were known to punish those who trespassed, fearing damage to their crops. If discovered, a peasant might be beaten, fined, or driven out. But desperation often outweighed fear. Hunger and exhaustion blurred the lines between right and wrong, and a few stolen hours of rest in a field could mean the strength to walk further the next day. Sometimes the road itself became the best. Travelers would lie just to the side, their bodies parallel to the dirt track, trusting that no late wagon would run them over in the dark. The advantage was simple. Roads were clear, relatively flat, and required no search. But lying exposed meant every cold gust of wind reached the skin, every drop of dew soaked the clothing, and there was no hiding from wandering eyes. Anyone who passed could see the sleeping forms stretched there, vulnerable and defenseless. For that reason, peasants often chose the road only when exhaustion made hiding impossible. Waterways, streams, rivers, and ponds added another element to their search for rest. Travelers knew that sleeping near water meant two things: life and danger. The soft grass of a riverbank was far kinder than bare soil, and the sound of moving water lulled many into sleep. Thirst could be quenched before lying down,
and if they had food, it could be washed. But water also drew animals, both harmless and threatening. A thirsty deer, a rooting pig, or even a wandering wolf could disturb the night. Mosquitoes swarmed thick near stagnant pools, and in the damp morning air, clothing would be soaked through with dew, making the next day's walk all the harder. Yet despite all this, weary peasants often found themselves drawn to riverbanks, for there was something irresistible in the steady rhythm of flowing water, like a promise that the world continued to move even as they rested. The body itself became an important tool in these makeshift cloaks doubled as blankets, shoes became pillows, and bundles of possessions, if any existed, were tucked under heads to protect them from theft. Some slept curled tightly to preserve warmth, while others stretched flat, too tired to care about the cold. The warmth of one's own breath under a cloak could be the only heat in a freezing night. For those traveling in groups, bodies pressed close together became the best defense against the chill. A small cluster of peasants might huddle in a ditch, shoulder to shoulder, drawing strength not only from shared warmth, but from the comfort of presence. Fires were rare for peasants. A flame could keep away animals and cold, but it could also draw unwanted attention. To light a fire required dry wood, flint, and most importantly, the courage to risk being seen. So most peasants accepted the night's chill rather than invite curiosity. In this way, they became nearly invisible in the landscape, like shadows lying quietly against the earth. For some, the church offered refuge even outside village boundaries. Wayside chapels and shrines dotted the countryside, small stone or wooden structures, often left unlocked. These sacred spaces, though not intended for sleep, became resting places for the desperate. To lie on the floor of a chapel, under the gaze of painted saints or a simple wooden cross, brought a strange sense of safety. Within those walls, peasants felt less likely to be disturbed by thieves or animals, but such rest carried risks as well. A passing priest or guard might drive them out, accusing them of disrespect. Still, many poor souls risked it, preferring the cold stone of a chapel floor to the endless uncertainty of the open road. Even caves and ruins, when found, became makeshift hostels. Abandoned huts, broken towers, or forgotten stone walls offered cover from the wind and rain. To stumble upon such shelter was like a small miracle, but such places often carried eerie reputations. Villagers whispered of spirits haunting ruins, of cursed stones where no one should lie. For peasants, though, fear of spirits was often outweighed by the need for rest. A roof, however broken, was better than none at all. So they would curl up against a crumbling wall, listening to the creak of old timbers or the drip of water through stone, and let themselves drift into uneasy dreams. Every choice carried its own discomforts, its own. Yet in all of these makeshift beds, hedgerows, fields, ditches, roadsides, chapels, ruins, the peasant found a kind of survival. Sleep did not mean peace, but endurance. It was never deep, never long, and rarely. It was simply enough to rise the next morning, stiff and tired, and begin again. And as dawn approached, the road would change. Mist crept across the fields, softening the edges of the world. Birds began to call, roosters crowed in distant villages, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. The peasants stirred from their hiding places, stretching stiff limbs, brushing dirt from their clothes. They gathered their small bundles, tightened their belts, and stepped back onto the path. Another day of walking, of hunger, of search. Another night ahead, waiting with the same question: where will we sleep when the road grows dark again?
The peasants moved further down the road, their bodies heavier with each step, though not from fatigue alone. The night had crept fully upon them, pressing with a darkness so absolute that only the faintest glimmers of moonlight outlined their figures. Every mile farther from the village meant one less chance of shelter, one more stretch of uncertain ground where they might have to settle. But the road gave no concern for their worries. It simply stretched on, cold, unbending, and indifferent, carrying them wherever their weary feet could endure. At last they stumbled upon an abandoned field. The land had once been cultivated, perhaps with rye or barley, but now it lay barren, covered in stiff weeds that crackled beneath their steps. To the peasant, even this forgotten patch was a blessing. The road had no roof, but here at least the tall grass might serve as a crude blanket against the wind. Slowly they dropped their few belongings, a sack, a stick, a tin pot, and sat themselves down among the stalks. One man pulled his cloak tighter, wrapping it around his knees. Another stretched himself flat upon the earth, letting the rough ground take his weight. The women, more cautious, searched for a hollow where the grass bent low, so the children could curl inside it as if within a nest. The little ones pressed against each other, shoulder to shoulder, as if their closeness might summon warmth out of the air. The mothers hummed softly, not quite a song, but something to ease restless ears into stillness. For peasants, the road was not just a line between towns. It was a bed, a hearth, a prison, and a grave all at once. Tonight it would serve as their bed, though the comfort it offered was thin. The earth grew cold quickly. Every stone beneath a blanket felt like iron. Every gust of wind reminded them of how little stood between their flesh and the sky. They did not complain. This was what it meant to travel without coin, to rest where one could, without bargaining for an inn, without expecting a room. Occasionally one might dream of those inns they passed by, the ones where merchants sat by warm fires, mugs of ale steaming in their hands, where straw mattresses lay soft and dry. But such thoughts were dangerous for the poor. To imagine comfort only sharpened the pain of its absence. Better to accept the weeds, the dirt, and the chill as companions, rather than dwell on luxuries forever beyond reach. Still, the night held its own strange rhythm. Above them, the stars wheeled silently across the sky, brilliant and countless. For men and women accustomed to narrow huts and smoky rafters, the sight of such vastness could strike something deeper than fear. It was a reminder of how small their lives were, and how endless the world seemed beyond the fields and villages they knew. Sometimes a peasant lying on the road might stare upward until his eyes watered, wondering if anyone in the heavens looked back. But the heavens gave no answer, only the faint sweep of constellations and the occasional call of an owl in the dark. So they turned inward, toward the human closeness that kept them alive. One man loaned his cloak to another. A mother spread her skirt across a sleeping child, and though the ground was cruel the night long, and the wind sharp, sleep crept upon them at last. It came in shallow waves, never deep, never safe. The rustle of grass or the snap of a twig could stir half the company awake, hearts racing at the thought of thieves or wolves. But even restless sleep was precious. For peasants, dreams were the only coin they could spend without cost. In dreams they might imagine themselves at home, or at a feast, or walking roads that led not to hunger, but to plenty. Dreams blurred the edges of poverty, if only for a few hours. Dawn, however, was less forgiving. It came grey and damp, with a mist that settled on their hair and cloaks like icy dew. The ground they had chosen as a bed now seemed harder than ever, and their bodies groaned with stiffness. Yet there was no time to linger. The road never allowed one to stay long in its embrace. With slow motions, they gathered their few possessions, shook the dew from their clothes, and rose once more to continue their march. Thus the cycle repeated, night after night, mile after mile. The road was endless, and the peasants were bound to it, walking when the sun burned, resting when the stars commanded. Each day they carried the same hope, that somewhere ahead, just beyond the next bend, there might be a barn with space for their bodies, or a farmer generous enough to let them sleep on dry straw. Yet more often than not, it was only the bare earth that received them. The earth never spoke, but it always accepted them. It gave them no pillow, no warmth, no promise of safety, and still it was there, patient, unyielding, ready to cradle their exhaustion, as it had cradled countless travelers before them. For poor peasants, the road was not only a path to walk, but the only bed they could truly call their own. As the night deepens, the old road continues to stretch onward, though no one can say where it truly ends. For the weary peasants, it was never about the destination, but about surviving another day and finding a patch of ground soft enough to surrender to sleep. By now the fields are quiet, the village sounds far away, and the stars above have taken their posts like silent watchmen. The peasants lay their thin bodies down, not on beds of feather or linen, but on earth, hay, or even the hard surface of a stone floor. And yet, despite the discomfort, sleep always comes, because fatigue was its own gentle command. Imagine the slow breathing of peasants along the roadside. One man curls near a boundary wall, straw beneath his head, his arms tucked close for warmth. Another woman, clutching her child, sits upright against a tree, head bobbing as slumber pulls her under. Further along, a group of traveling laborers huddle near the remains of a fire, the last embers glowing faintly, casting shadows that flicker like tired candlelight. Sleep does not ask whether the ground is cold or the body sore. It simply arrives, heavy and irresistible. The night is not quiet in the countryside. Dogs bark in the distance, owls cry from branches, and insects sing their endless chorus. The peasants, too used to noise, allow it to become part of the dreamscape. They sleep beside creaking carts, groaning oxen, and the murmuring wind. Sometimes they wake briefly, shivering or shifting, but exhaustion presses them back down, and the cycle begins again. What would sound harsh to you becomes lullabies to them. The clatter of hooves on the distant road is reassurance. Life goes on, even in the dark. On some nights, sleep is shallow. A sharp wind stirs, carrying the smell of rain, and bodies shift closer together. Thin wool cloaks are pulled tighter, straw mats dragged up from the ground to cover legs. The unlucky ones without covering curl tightly, trying to conserve the heat of their breath beneath cupped hands. Their sleep becomes a series of short fragments, broken by shivers, before fatigue overtakes them again. The body, after all, always claims its rest. Even without comfort, sleep comes, wrapping them like an old blanket. Think of the peasants who travel between villages, their belongings tied in a sack, their feet blistered from walking. By the time night falls, they can no longer carry on. So they lie where the road allows, a patch of meadow, a hollow under a tree, the lean side of a ruined chapel. The hard ground presses against their bones, but their eyes close, their breathing evens, and in that simple act, the night becomes bearable. Sleep erases hunger, weariness, and sorrow, if only for a few hours. For children it is easy. They lie down beside their parents, their small bodies curling instinctively toward warmth. Within minutes they drift into dream, unaware of the stones beneath them, or the chill in the air. For the old it is harder. Bones ache, joints stiffen, and sleep comes reluctantly, broken by pain. Still, even the oldest peasant finds some moments of deep rest, where the body forgets its suffering and floats in silence. Sleep, after all, was the one luxury no one could take away. Sometimes, peasants slept inside barns, given a corner by a farmer in exchange for a day's labor. The barn was noisy with animals, the straw dusty and prickly, but compared to the open road, it was heaven. The warmth of cows breathing nearby, the steady sound of hooves shifting in the straw, created a rhythm that coaxed even the most restless mind into slumber. Imagine lying there, hearing the steady creak of rafters above, the smell of hay all around, the flicker of a lantern burning low. Slowly breath deepens, eyes grow heavy, and the world fades. On rare occasions, a charitable monastery would open its doors to peasants, letting them sleep on the stone floor of a hall. No blankets, no pillows, just a place out of the cold. Rows of bodies stretched across the floor like fallen leaves. One by one they succumbed to sleep, the stone unyielding beneath them, but still softer than the road outside. In the silence of the monastery, broken only by distant chanting or the ringing of a bell, peasants found a rare peace. They may not have dreamed of riches, but for a night they dreamed in safety. Sleep on the road was never uninterrupted. A barking dog, a passing cart, or a sudden fear of thieves could stir a body awake. Eyes would blink open, scanning the dark, ears straining. But once the danger passed, drowsiness returned, as inevitable as gravity. The peasants knew that tomorrow would demand every ounce of strength, tilling soil, carrying loads, walking miles. Sleep was not a choice, but a necessity. They surrendered to it, however rough the ground. And yet, despite the hardship, there was a certain poetry to these nights. The sky above, vast and star-filled, belonged to no one and everyone at once. A peasant lying on the roadside looked up at the same constellations kings admired from their chambers. The difference was comfort, not beauty. And so, beneath the cold glitter of the stars, peasants found themselves part of something eternal. Their sleep may have been rough, but it was shared with the whole turning world. As the hours passed, dreams came, dreams of warm bread, of safe hearths, of harvests without hunger, dreams of better roads, kinder lords, gentler winters. These dreams did not change reality, but they softened it, like a pillow stuffed with straw instead of feathers. The peasants awoke still poor, still weary, but in those hours of dream, they touched another life. Perhaps in some small way, that was enough. Now as you listen, you too can imagine yourself along that road. The air is cool, the ground uneven, but your body grows heavy. You find a hollow in the earth. Lay your head down and listen to the quiet rhythm of the night. The stars above keep watch. The wind moves gently through the grass, and somewhere, a tired ox shifts in its sleep. Your own breathing begins to slow, your thoughts to wander. Just as the peasants surrendered to sleep, so can you. Feel the weight of the day drift away. You don't need a feather bed or a blanket of silk. You only need rest, and rest is already here. With each breath, you sink deeper, until the road, the peasants, the night itself, all blur into dream. You are safe, you are still, you are drifting. Let go, and let the silence of the medieval road become your own lullaby. Sleep now, just as they did. Sleep, and let the night carry you.